Radio Dum Dum Radio. Always
Whoa, Richard, Radio Richard.
When Fred Wesley said Philadelphia International was funk with a bow tie, he was describing more than just the polished production values of the record label. Now, whereas James Brown's funk was designed for the street, the Philadelphia sound was the music of people who wanted to dress up in expensive, fashionable clothes and go to expensive, fashionable clubs, but nevertheless, get funky. Having gone through the process of integration and the social advancement made possible in the 1960s, Black America in the 1970s wanted music to reflect their new affluence and class. Because of this difference of purpose, the Philly sound used orchestral instruments in a more expansive way to produce a more polished, sophisticated sound. Rhythm sections, instead of being small units playing repetitive vamps, expanded to include a variety of percussion instruments, negotiating the more complex harmonic progressions of jazz and Tin Pan Alley. Producer-songwriters Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff formed Philadelphia International Records, known as PIR. They evolved a new genre that became known as the Sound of Philadelphia. PIR took over from Motown as the preeminent black music label of the 70s, with many hit artists including the O'Jays, the Intruders, Billy Paul, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Teddy Pendergrass, the 3 Degrees, Archie Bell and the Drells, McFadden and Whitehead, and Lou Rawls. I interviewed producer, songwriter, and arranger Bobby Eli for my book, The Invisible Artist, in 2008. Now, Bobby was a member of Mother, Father, Sister, Brother, playing guitar on many of the most successful PIR hits of the 70s, working with their biggest artists and most significant arrangers. As a founder member of the PIR team, Bobby was able to give us an articulate and detailed understanding of the genesis and history of the Philadelphia sound, and here, for the first time, is our complete interview. Check it out. Bobby, it's great to meet you on the phone.
Oh, it's great to meet you too as well, Richard.
One of the main things that you, more than anybody else could do for us, is explain what the essential elements of the Philadelphia sound are.
Okay, I'll be glad to. Philadelphia has always been a hybrid of sounds emanating from various neighborhoods, with each neighborhood being indigenous to a specific type of sound. For example, South Philly gave birth to all the teen idols, such as Fabian, Frankie Avalon, Bobby Rydell, Chubby Checker, etc. Southwest Philly gave birth to the smooth doo-wop sounds, such as Lee Andrews and the Hearts, the Superiors, groups like that. North Philly was a little harder edged. You had Howard Tate, you had Garnett Mims, the Intruders. There was also a doo-wop element, but a little bit of a harder edged doo-wop, you know. And West Philly was a hybrid of all the above. You know, you had Solomon Burke out of West Philly. You had the Dovells, you know, which were Blue-Eyed Soul. Darrell Hall, who actually came from Pottstown, which was a northwest suburb of Philadelphia. So you had all that put into a melting pot of a big musical stew, and there you have it, you know. I guess the seeds of what we came to know as the Philly sound, the soulful sound of the Philly sound anyway, the soulful element, started with the Dixie Hummingbirds, you know, back in the 30s with their gospel roots, with their chicken and grits part of this musical stew that we're talking about. And later on down the line, in the early 50s, we had a company called Grand Records, which was based in West Philly, around 41st and Lancaster, which was known then as The Bottom. Grand Records gave birth to a group called the Castells, who had a big regional hit called My Girl Awaits Me. This was around maybe 53, 54, if I'm not mistaken. All right? This was like, that had to be one of the first soulful Philadelphia records, I guess you could say. All right? Now, right around that time, you had the Revels around 1955 had a song called Cha-Cha Tony, which led to a song called Midnight Stroll, which was one of the first records of that type to be featured on American Bandstand. Okay, now, right around that time, Leandros and the Hearts started getting hits with the Try the Impossible, Teardrops, Long Lonely Nights. This was the early Philadelphia doo-wop soul sound. Okay, now, let's fast track to around 1961. The city of Camden, New Jersey, which is right across the bridge, the Delaware River from Philadelphia, there was a young gentleman named Leon Huff. Leon Huff used to play his piano in church. I was fortunate to go to one of these church sessions on several occasions and witness firsthand his feel, his gospel feel on the piano, and it amazed me. And I got to know him, and I was invited to go to his home, and we got to hang out, and it was great. Okay, right after that, I started playing with a gentleman by the name of Herb Johnson. We formed a group called Herb Johnson and the Impacts, and we would work all around Philadelphia at the time. And there was a little club in West Philly called the Vegas Bar, and we were like a fixture over there in that club. And there was a guy that used to come in there named Kenny. Kenny was a struggling singer-songwriter in the neighborhood who also was a lab technician at this place called Misericordia Hospital. So Kenny used to always say, "Hey, Eli, can I get up on the stage and sing a couple numbers?" And I said, "Why, certainly." And this Kenny turned out to be the one and only Kenny Gamble. Okay, so Kenny had a knack. He always had this little specific knack for coming up with really great ideas, and we became fast friends at that particular time. We're going to fast forward maybe 3 years. Okay, one day I was at Leon Huff's house hanging out, and I had a group with me that we were rehearsing with. And I heard Huff on the phone speaking to someone, and he had mentioned, quote unquote, he said, "Hey, Huff, there's this bad white boy over here on a guitar, his name is Bobby Eli, man, you should hear him." So apparently the retort from Gamble apparently was the fact that he knew me. And one thing led to another, and right around that time they were starting to get their writing and producing thing together, right at the very beginning. So from that point on, I was elected to be part of their fledgling operation, and one of the guys in the studio that later became known as MFSB. And actually a year before that, befriended a very nice guy who I know and am very tight with to this day, named Weldon Arthur McDougall III. And that's what he likes to be called, the Third. So anyway, he actually met me one day while I was waiting for the bus coming out of school with my guitar, and says, "Hey man, can you play that thing?" I says, "Why, certainly. I've been told that I can play it." He says, "Oh yeah? Well, I'm going to the studio right now for a session. You want to come along?" And I said, "Why, yeah, why not?" I was kind of trepidatious at first, and my mom told me to watch out for strangers in long Cadillac sedans, and I said, "Well, all right, I'll give it a shot." I went up to the studio. It was called Virtue Recording on North Broad Street, which recently was torn down, and there's a parking lot there. In any event, I went up there, and he was recording. He had a group called the Larks, and they were recording a song called Rain. And anyway, he said, "Hey man, take your guitar out, let me see what you can do." He has a deep bass voice, better than mine. So anyway, I said, okay. I had this red Gibson guitar. I took it out and started strumming along, and he says, "Oh man, you sound good, man. You sound good. Let me keep playing." So then he had these girls over there he was getting ready to record. They were called the Tiffany's, and they had this song called Gossip. And he says, "Hey man, could you do something with that?" I says, "Yeah, I'll give it a shot." So I did something with that too. And he started taking me around to the studios, and he introduced me to a guy called Jimmy Bishop, who had just come in from Detroit to get a job at WDAS Radio in Philadelphia. So Jimmy Bishop, in conjunction with Weldon and two more guys called Johnny Stiles and Luther Randolph, started a company called Dino Dynamic Productions, which was based in West Philly. And the first artist that they signed to Dino Dynamic was a young lady from North Philly. Her name is Barbara Mason. Barbara Mason used to live in North Philly around the corner from my lady friend Bonnie. Okay, there was a young lady called Kissy who lived in Richard Allen Homes. Kissy who lived next door to one of the Larks, whose name was Bill Oxendine. And anyway, one thing led to another, and a recommendation was made to Weldon McDougall that, hey man, you should hear this girl Barbara. She can play the piano and write songs. One day at Virtue Studios, an appointment was made to bring Barbara up to the studio, and she was running late. Weldon had to go down to the projects to pick her up. Her and Kissy came up there, and anyway, Weldon said, Barbara, sit down at the piano, let me hear some of your songs. So the first one that she did was a song called Girls Have Feelings Too, which was actually the very first release on a label called Crusader out of California. Next session was the one that produced Yes, I'm Ready, our very first smash. Weldon, we were talking about musicians and upgrading the embodiment of the rhythm section that was happening at that time, because prior to our little hookup, so anyway, I recommended an old friend of mine called Ronnie Baker, bass player. Ronnie came over, and the first session that he played on was Yes, I'm Ready. Ronnie suggested guitarist Norman Harris, and Yes, I'm Ready was the first song that he played on. We were doing a session with the Volcanoes. I think it was Storm Warning, and that particular drummer, Skip, didn't show up, but there was a gentleman in the corner by the name of Earl, who was actually a bass singer. And Earl says, well, if Skip doesn't show up, let me try that. Let me see if I could do it. So Earl sat down on the drums, man, and he had the most impeccable timing one could ever ask for. He was like a human metronome, and he dug in and played so hard, man. You know, and hey, that was actually the real, I guess, birth of our rhythm section right there, MFSB.
Now, would there be an arranger on that session, or somebody who would be
Yes.
kind of like the MD? Who was that?
Yes, well, they varied, but I can give you a rundown on how this actually, the whole arranging thing, the whole process. Okay, now Bobby Martin, who we all know was the main arranger for Philadelphia International, got his start on a session by the Dream Lovers called When We Get Married back in the early 60s. That was the very first credit, I believe, that he got as an arranger. And he was the one who directed the musicians in the studio and told them what to play. You know, a few years later, with the onset of the Gamble and Huff situation, Bobby got involved in that deal and started arranging all the early hits for the Intruders, including United, Cowboys to Girls, and he had a stamp, a specific groove, later on known as the Philly groove, that was indigenous to his arranging style.
Can you explain that groove? Can you give the
Sure.
listeners a little idea of what that was?
Okay, early on, it kind of evolved. If you remember some of the early mid 60s arrangements, they always had that 16th note horn part, like da 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 dum da dum da dum dum da da da. That was indigenous to Bobby Martin / Kenny Gamble's collective style of arranging and producing. They always had that sort of the 16th note accent thing in the horn section, and you always had a very flowing legato string line over that. And what started also around this time was Norman Harris was known to play the sort of Wes Montgomery octave style on his guitar, and Vince Montana, who played vibes, would double the line in octaves. You know, there was always a guitar backbeat on 2 and 4. Sometimes I would do it early on. Sometimes the late great Roland Chambers, who recently passed away, he would do it. So that was like the early kind of the earlier elements of the Philly sound. Now, a lot of the musicians, the string and horn players in particular, well, the horn players were steeped in a jazz background, you know. I mean, unlike the Motown guys that predated us, the Philadelphia guys had more of a hybrid of various styles. You had a lot of bebop horn players like Zach Zachary, who did all the alto sax parts on all the PIR Philadelphia International sessions. He actually played with Count Basie. Man, you know, he was back in there with the greats. and he had that bebop kind of vibe happening. Vince Montana was and is a great jazz musician. He brings a lot of that 30s and 40s jazz feel with him too, you know. And if you listen to the Philadelphia International, a lot of their albums, there's always especially Billy Paul, you'll hear a lot of jazz influence. You'll hear it with the Salsoul Orchestra. You'll hear a lot of jazz run. So a lot of the musicians have that inbred, you know, being raised with people like Charlie Parker, who comes from Philadelphia, you know, that John Coltrane. You have all that wonderful jazz, gospel jazz element going on. You also have Earl Young with his hard funk. You know, there's such a hybrid. Philadelphia had such a unique hybrid of styles, in my opinion, unlike a lot of the other regional areas noted for specific sounds. You know, it had a certain stamp that only Philadelphia had. Thombell originally was a member of Kenny Gamble and the Romeos, which included Thombell on piano, the late Carl Chambers on drums, the late Roland Chambers on guitar, wonderful bassist Win Wilford on bass, and Kenny Gamble on vocals. Now, out of this group came Thombell, who, through this situation, got a job at Cameo Parkway Records as an in-house arranger, starting out with some of the later Chubby Checker records, and then he also went on the road as Chubby Checker's piano player. Around this time, let's say 1966, he had met a gentleman by the name of Stan Watson, who was starting a new company called Philly Groove Records out of West Philly. So Tom had introduced Stan to some young guys from his neighborhood known as the DELPHONICS. They actually had another name before that. I forgot what their name was. I'll have to find out. But they were from around 55th and Master, which is in West Philly. So Tom brought them up to Stan Watson's office at the time, which was at 52nd and Spruce in Philadelphia, and Stan took a liking to them and took them in a studio, which was at the time Cameo Parkway Studios, right, on Broad and Spruce, and they recorded a song called He Don't Really Love You, which was released on a company called Moonshot out of New York. He Don't Really Love You was somewhat of a regional hit, East Coast regional hit, and that led to a singles deal for Cameo Parkway with a song called You've Been Untrue. So right after that, the seed money was gotten by Stan Watson to start his own label, real label called Philly Groove. Lala Means I Love You by the DELPHONICS was the first record to be released on Philly Groove, and it was a smash, an unadulterated smash, and Thombell's first gold record, certified gold record. And from then on, you know, the rest is history with Thombell. And right around the time that he produced the DELPHONICS on Didn't I Blow Your Mind, he met a little young Jewish girl from Germantown called Linda Creed, right? Linda Creed was the vocalist of a group called Soul Brothers Ltd., who were a little funk jazz bar band out of Norristown. And Linda was the vocalist, and she dabbled in, more than dabbled. She was one heck of a lyric writer, probably one of the best to ever come out of Philadelphia or anywhere else for that matter. Someone introduced her to Tom, and they started collaborating on songs, and their musical marriage was just a magic made in heaven, man. It was just wonderful. And the very first song that was recorded by the team of Bell and Creed was a song called Free Girl, I Want to Be a Free Girl by Dusty Springfield on the Dusty in Philadelphia album that Gamble and Huff and Bell produced back in 1970. And I was there, and the elation that Linda felt in the studio after hearing that playback, man, I could see her now just waltzing around the studio, man, just elated to hear that song coming over the speakers. It was wonderful, man. And she was the most wonderful person, great girl, not affected by her success. Unfortunately, we all know she passed away in 1986 from a long bout with cancer. And at the time that she passed away, she was #1 on the charts with The Greatest Love of All. So that was one heck of a way to go out, man, I'll tell you. Also, some of the other arrangers of note out of the Philadelphia scene were and are Jack Faith. Jack Faith has a real kind of jazzy tinge to his arrangements. You know, he's a sax player, alto sax, and who can be heard prominently on the intro to Love Won't Let Me Wait by Major Harris. That sax intro, that's Jack Faith, man. He's a monster. He's a monster, still is. And Games People Play by the Spinners was very indigenous of the Jack Faith style of arranging. Very good arrangement. I mean, there are some that, you know, obviously some Spinners songs that Thombell didn't arrange, that being one of them. Also, their version of the Wilson Pickett song, Don't Let the Green Grass Fool You, was a Jack Faith arrangement. Those were two prime examples. Tons of Philadelphia International. I mean, Jack was also on the staff of Philadelphia International. A lot of the Close the Door, I believe, by Teddy Pendergrass. A lot of the post 1976 Philadelphia International records. Lou Rawls, I think You'll Never Find Another Love Like Mine. When Bobby Martin moved to Los Angeles to work with A&M, so that gave Jack Faith more work over there at Philadelphia International. So you'll find the majority, I would say, of the Philadelphia International records, the hits anyway, Jack Faith had a hand in arranging. He was also one of the copyists when other arrangers had to go and get their songs copied onto individual sheets from the master charts. Jack Faith would be the one who did that. Richie Rome is another great musician from Philadelphia. His arrangements are, I guess you could say, flourishy, more sort of classical sounding. His strings have a classical edge to them. You know, he's very good and very quick, man. He could probably arrange a whole album in one day. That's how bad he is, man. When I say bad, that's a positive bad, you know. In the mid-'70s, actually, there's a group called the Ritchie Family, which had a lot of big disco hits, and they named their group from, for Richie Rome. That's why it's called the Ritchie Family. And there was no name and there was no group. But when we went in the studio to do the tracks, the tracks were done before there was a group, and the three girls were actually hired backing singers at the time. So that whole Ritchie Family thing evolved, and the rest is history. Now, Vince Montana, who I mentioned before as a vibes player, jazz arranger, came up with an idea back in 1974. He had a couple of Latin acts out of Kensington area in Philadelphia. We do have a Kensington in Philly also. He had a couple of Hispanic acts that he was trying to shop, and there was a company called K-Tronics, which was on 10th Avenue in New York. They were a distributor of Latin music. They were run by a family called the Carey Brothers, and it was Kenny, Joe, and Stan, and their father, also Joe, I believe. Anyway, so Vince Montana made an appointment to go shop his product one day, and they started to talking about different things and ideas, and Joe Baton, the well-known Latin artist, was up there, and he had just had a little interesting record out called The Bottles, remake of the old Gil Scott-Heron record. Anyway, they got started to talking, and one thing led to another, and they thought, well, hey man, why not fuse Latin salsa music with soul and see what comes up? And Vince came up with the title Salsoul, which was a contraction of salsa and soul. So Vince Montana gave birth to that whole Salsoul thing, which we all know became large. And originally it was just a concept, Salsoul, but it actually evolved into the record company. The very first song was called Salsoul Hustle. Interestingly enough, it was recorded in New York at Columbia Studios. It wasn't recorded in Philly. There were like 2 or 3 songs that were done up there as an experiment. But right after that, everything else subsequently was recorded at Sigma Sound in Philadelphia. And Interestingly, Salsoul Records had the first commercially released 12-inch called 10% by Double Exposure. Okay, very important man. Peter DeAngelis. Okay, Peter DeAngelis was also a classically trained gentleman who used to take a lot of trips to Rome. He was inspired by all the great musicians in the Rome Symphony Orchestra. And his history actually goes back to the early Teen Idol days, where he was co-owner of a company called Chancellor in Philadelphia with a guy called Bob Marcucci, and they had Fabi and Frankie Avalon and that kind of element over there. And Peter DeAngelis was the arranger also on all those songs. So then he started getting involved in R&B, and one of his first hits as an arranger-producer on the soul side was "Hey There Lonely Girl" by Eddie Holman, which was recorded at a studio called Virtue that I talked about earlier with Weldon McDougall in North Philadelphia. There was Virtue Studios where "Hey There Lonely Girl" was recorded, and Peter was very, very, very instrumental. He's no longer with us as well. It's a shame that a lot of the greats have gone on to greener pastures, and I'm sure they have a big band up there in the sky, man. One day I'll be up there with them too, and we could jam together again, man. That'd be one beautiful experience, let me tell you.
If we could go back to Bobby Martin also,
Yes.
and just talk a little bit about his background and how he came in.
Certainly. Bobby Martin used to play vibes with a jazz band called Lynn Hope, who had a brother called Billy Hope, who also was a jazz musician. This was I believe in the 50s, and Bobby would travel around with Lynn Hope as the vibes player and sometimes piano as well. It led him to a gentleman by the name of Jerry Ross, who started a company called Heritage Records in Philadelphia, and he's a gentleman who signed the Dream Lovers. Okay, there was a gentleman called Harold B. Robinson. Harold B. Robinson had a automobile dealership on North Broad Street in Philadelphia. In the basement of that particular building, there was a recording studio. And that was the recording studio that eventually recorded When We Get Married by the Dream Lovers. But prior to that, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells recorded I Sold My Heart to the Junk Man and Down the Aisle down in that particular studio. That's where Bobby Martin was actually first discovered, because Lynn Hope had also recorded some sides down there, and upon recommendation from Lynn Hope to Harold B. Robinson introduced Bobby Martin to Jerry Ross.
Can you maybe give a list of some of Bobby Martin's sort of greatest hits, the songs that he worked on?
How much time do you have?
Well, I mean, that's why I say the greatest hits. It's just that, oddly enough, it's actually very difficult to get information on Bobby Martin. There's very little written about him, and
Wow.
So any information you can give us would be great.
First and foremost, he was a wonderful man, is a wonderful man, and helped me out tremendously, and I'll get to that later. I'll start from Cowboys to Girls by the Intruders, which was his first gold record. Okay, I mean the United and Together were also Bobby Martin arrangements by the Intruders, which predated Cowboys to Girls, but I'll start with that one as being the first smash. So from Cowboys to Girls, Western Union Man by Jerry Butler. You had Only the Strong Survive by Jerry Butler. Most of the first two Jerry Butler albums that Gamble and Huff produced, the first one being The Iceman Cometh, the second one was called Ice on Ice, which were big albums. Most of those songs on there were Bobby Martin's. Then, as soon as Philadelphia International Records was started in 1971, you had You're the Reason Why by the Ebonies, which was a big R&B hit. Now, in 1972, when the OJs came on board to Philadelphia International, you had Backstabbers by the OJs, which was a smash that Bobby Martin arranged. You had most of that particular album. Now, Love Train was Tommy Bell. You had For the Love of Money, Bobby Martin. All right, I mean, humongous, giant records. You had Love is the Message by MFSB, the TSOP, the Soul Train theme. Those records, I think, were the cornerstone Philadelphia International records. I mean, if you had to really pick two songs that epitomized Bobby Martin's style of arranging and combined with the Philadelphia sound, you would have to put TSOP and Love Is a Message right up there as number 1 and number 2, because those were the Philadelphia sound personified, man. That was it, and then it kind of went up from there.
Can you give some examples from those tracks of the elements that to you personified it, the elements he put into those tracks?
Bobby Martin was a horn guy, you know. His horn charts, I guess coming from his jazz background, you could always tell his arrangements by the use of his horn punctuations. Also 16th notes, 8th notes. Okay, for instance, Love Is a Message, all right? You had this horn thing going da-dup, 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 that kind of rhythm, da-dup, da-dup, that was indigenous of that Bobby Martin / Philadelphia sound, and a lot of other arrangers copied. I don't want to say copied, but were influenced by. There's one more person, and I should have mentioned this earlier. Norman Harris was the guitar player I talked about earlier. Now, Norman Harris came from the school of Bobby Martin also. Bobby Martin begat Norman Harris, and he also begat Bobby Eli here. So we were students of his style. You know what I'm saying? We use that same kind of element. And Norman, oh man, that was my buddy. That was my best buddy. Unfortunately, he died too, and he was just wonderful. I mean, the Salsoul stuff, other than the ones Vince did, all the First Choice and Armed Extremely Dangerous, and I mean, Norman was the guy that did all that stuff, you know, and him and I learned our style and craft from Bobby Martin. Bobby Martin was the granddaddy, the teacher of us all when it came to arranging. Kiss and Say Goodbye by the Manhattans, which was the very first certified platinum single ever, was Kiss and Say Goodbye. So Bobby Martin's arranging style and his production as well, it was evident. And in that particular record, you had the horns that went da-dum, 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 dum. Then heard the news. I can't sing, but you know what I'm trying to talk about, you know. So he had that was a Bobby Martin touch, man. That was it, you know. And right after that, when Bobby went to L.A. to start working with A&M, he produced 3 or 4 multi-platinum albums on LTD. So if you listen to Back in Love Again by LTD, you'll definitely hear the Philly Bobby Martin / horn nuances, all those horn hits that he used to use in Philadelphia that were used on Back in Love Again. I mean, they were right there, man, in your face. We Deserve Each Other's Love, for instance, and that was Bobby Martin. Matter of fact, I was in L.A. at the time in the studio when he was recording that, so I witnessed it firsthand. And Bobby worked exactly the same in L.A. as he did in Philly. Everybody loved to work with him, man. He was just great. As a matter of fact, a few years before that, and the turn of the decade going into 1970 from 1969, he had produced a group called the Continental Four, and there was a little hit called Day by Day. So Bobby, being their producer, executive producer, mentor, and manager, him and I actually went on the road with them for a while to promote and play. We had a little kind of band that we put together for the purposes of working with the Continental Four. So that was fun. That was really great, man. We had our little station wagon, tied our instruments to the top with a tarpaulin and everything. It was great, man. Wonderful hanging out with Bobby on the road, exchanging stories and stuff. It was great.
You worked on so many sessions with him. Can you describe like one session that particularly comes to mind, like, you know, sort of from start to finish of making a record, particular song? Just to give his working method, to give us an idea of how he worked in the studio.
On the session that produced Kiss and Say Goodbye by the Manhattans, right? We were sitting downstairs in Studio 2 of Sigma Sound, and Bobby Martin had a drumstick in his hand, and he would use a drumstick as a baton to, like, you know, egg the musicians on, count off and whatever, and he was standing there, and all of a sudden he poked himself in the eye with a drumstick as he was counting off. So if you could picture the beginning of Kiss and Say Goodbye when Blue says, "This is the saddest day of my life," and you hear me with my little guitar sounding like Chet Atkins. Right before that, the count off, imagine Bobby Martin poking himself in the eye with a drumstick. So, you know, that actually made us feel good. It actually, I guess, gave us a little zing for the track. So the energy level kind of, it was like 11 o'clock in the morning, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, we had to have a little bit of energy after our cups of coffee, you know. So,
Sure.
you know, but I mean, technically, what Bobby Martin, his modus operandi, so to speak, he would come in always on time. You know, Bobby was punctual, never late. You know, and he expected the same thing from his musicians. He would come in with his music already done up, generally a chord chart. You know, a chord chart with maybe little specific lines. You know, there was nothing very specific. There were just little lines that we could expound upon. You know. And maybe a guitar line here and there, but for the most part, I had the freedom. Norman Harris had the, as I said before, the melodic West Montgomery jazz kind of feel. And anytime you heard that, it was Norman Harris. Anytime you heard anything else, it was me. So if you had an effect, or maybe an electric sitar or wah-wah or fuzz, anything that was affected, it was me. Because I was affected, so it translated into my pedals. You know, that was the juxtaposition of the two guitar players, or sometimes three guitar players with the Roland Chambers. So that the rhythm section always was Earl Young on drums, Ronnie Baker on bass, the guitar players that I mentioned before on guitar, Larry Washington, also the late great. Everybody's late great, man. It's a shame. Larry Washington on congas, who was the class clown. Larry was the class clown, man. I mean, without him, he was the heart and soul and the glue that held us all together, man. With his little percussion, conga, congo, bongo, whatever stuff that he did, man. That was it. So he was on percussion. Vince Montana always played the vibes, and as far as the piano and keyboards and stuff, it varied. With Bobby Martin's sessions, it was usually a guy called Ron Kersey. Ron Kersey actually co-wrote Disco Inferno. Ron Kersey, right after he came out of the Army in 1973, he was so good that after playing with the First Choice in their band called Prime Cut, he was discovered by Norman Harris, who brought him into the session world with us. And the other keyboard player that we used to use along with him was Carlton Kent, who we called Cotton Kent, because, you know, that's a long story anyway. So Cotton Kent was, he was great. He was just so well-versed, man. He could do anything from jazz to barrel house blues. I mean, you name it, man. He was great. So because that was the non-Gamble and Huff hookup. With the Gamble and Huff crew, usually, obviously, was Leon Huff on piano, and Lenny Piccola or Thombell on the other keyboards, on organ or any harpsichord or what have you. But that was generally the MO, and Bobby was also he was great at getting the best performance out of a vocalist. I mean, his manner, I can't even put my finger on it, but he knew how to work with people. He was a great, you know, psychiatrist, if you will. You know, he knew just the right things to say to the singers to get that performance. When I saw him working with Jeffrey Osborne doing the vocal on We Deserve Each Other's Love, it was magic, man. And Jeffrey came in and maybe he was not in the greatest mood that day or whatever, that night rather. Bobby Martin put him in the right frame of mind, and that performance was just killer, man, right there. And then he punched in some little lines after the fact, and the rest is history. But Bobby, he's a master all the way around. You know, he's just a great guy, and everybody loved to work with him. I'll explain how Thom Bell works. It's a different kind of M.O. First of all, Thom Bell was a graduate of a music conservatory. He was probably the only arranger in Philadelphia that I can think that was actually a graduate of a musical conservatory, similar to what Juilliard would be in New York, you know. But there was one in Philadelphia that he went to. He was a child prodigy, Thom Bell. He was also very heavily influenced by Burt Bacharach. And if you notice, a lot of Thom Bell records had time signatures that changed, just like Burt Bacharach did. He would have all these crazy time signatures, that some people would construe as where you would need 3 legs to dance to them, but some kind of way it worked, and Tom was very, very adamant, I guess you could say. He would write all the notes out, everything. I mean, even drum music. And matter of fact, one day when Earl Young was doing a Delphonics record, Earl was actually just starting to get into reading music, because he wasn't really, a lot of us at that time weren't really that adept at actually reading notes per se. So a fly landed on Earl's music paper, and Earl read the fly, thinking that it was an eighth note, So Tom looked around. I mean, Tom had ears everywhere, and he heard a certain note that wasn't on the music, and that was Earl hitting the fly that was on the music paper as one of the notes. So Tom used to say the word bub a lot. He had a high voice. That's not it, bub. That's not it, bub. Try it again, bub. By the way, I was Ellsworth Bunker. He had names here. I was Ellsworth Bunker. Larry Washington was Biscuit Nose. Ronnie Baker was the G-Bus, because he thought his forehead looked like the G-Bus waiting on the corner. And everybody had a nickname. Leon Huff was Beaver. Gamble was Gams. So Bell was Bellboy. So anyway, so that was it. And Tom was very adamant on having his arrangements just so. And I was actually, I think, honored and privileged as being one of the first rhythm guys to have the distinction of having somewhat of a bit of freedom by playing something that wasn't on the music, as in Then Came You by Dionne Warwick and the Spinners had a little like wah-wah part in there and a little fuzz part that actually wasn't written, and I was just messing around, and Tom looked over in the corner with that little look with his eyes wide open like, what are you doing that for? But then he changed his mind and says, Ellsworth, let's try that. That sounds good, man. That sounds good, bub. So anyway, Bub got his chance to be, had his little style there. You know what I'm saying? Then I did all the sitar parts, which were written note for note, like on Didn't I Blow Your Mind, on You Make Me Feel Brand New, and all that stuff. I was doing. It was an instrument called the choral electric sitar, so I played that on there. It was kind of had a cardboard feel, but what can I tell you?
Now, was that his idea to put that in, or did you have the instrument already?
In that particular case, it was his idea. I mean, the instrument was part of the studio. It was in the back room at Sigma Sound. It was part of the studio instruments. If I'm not mistaken, I think Didn't I Blow Your Mind this time was the first one that he tried that on. So all that stuff he wrote out note for note. A lot of other records by other arrangers and producers, sometimes we would improvise and make up stuff, but he was very adamant on having everything just so. And he was great, man. I mean, Thom Bell to me was the consummate musician's musician, and he didn't let anything slip away. He could hear everything, man, a mile away, and everything. Just if you listen and compare notes and listen to everybody's style, you'll notice how Thom Bell's records are very more exacting than anybody else. He didn't get away with any mistakes. He even did I Love Music by the OJs. He did the string arrangements on, which was kind of unique because Tom mainly only liked to arrange the songs that he produced. And with I Love Music, Gamble and Huff produced it, but Tom liked it, so he did the string chart on it, which was great.
When you recorded all this stuff, how much of it was recorded like live with the rhythm section and the orchestra, or how much of it did you overdub the orchestra later? Okay,
98% of the time, the rhythm section was done first. Now, there have been some instances early on, and the early Delphonics, starting with Didn't I Blow Your Mind, and that group of sessions, which included Ready or Not, Here I Come, the Delphonics theme, there was another name for that one. Anyway, that stuff, interestingly enough, was done live. Stan Watson wanted to try to do everything live and see what it sounded like, so you could hear all the room spill, and it created another kind of character to the record. So we had to set up the studio in a different manner at that time, but it was great. I mean, everybody in that room, and it wasn't a giant room. It wasn't tiny, but it wasn't big like, let's say, a Columbia or RCA or any kind of like sound stage studio that was set up especially for an orchestra. But it worked. Also, there were some Patti LaBelle sessions in the 80s on the album that included If Only You Knew. That song wasn't live, but there were some jazzier ones. I forget the titles, but there were some live ones in there that, as a matter of fact, not only was the music live, but she was as well. She was in the vocal booth doing her vocals. We also did, when you talk about live, we did an album with Wilson Pickett called Wilson Pickett in Philadelphia with Gamble and Huff that Bobby Martin did most of the charts on. And there was a song called Engine Number 9 on there, which was done live in the studio with him doing the vocal. It was just rhythm. There was I don't think there was any overdubs on there. Maybe some horns later on down the line, but the essence of the feel and the groove and his performance had to be captured live because of who he is. And it was great, just him being there, and it just went on for like 15 minutes, I think. It was just wonderful. You know, that's the way Pickett is, man. He's that's why he's the wicked Pickett.
Yeah,
Right.
Bobby, I've got to say, I wish everyone who I interviewed could be like you, man. You are unbelievable.
Radio Richard. Like, share, subscribe, even donate. Radio Richard. Be informed. Be amazed. Be inspired.